In the heart of Africa, where the jungle breathes and the soil remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, there once rose a man who believed himself a god. His name was Jean-Bédel Bokassa, a soldier, a ruler, and eventually an emperor. But history would not remember him for his crowns or conquests. It would remember him for his hunger. They called him the Emperor of Blood. Once he was nothing, a poor boy born in the shadow of colonial France's grip on Africa. His father, defiant against French rule, died in prison. His mother, shattered by grief, took her own life. And from that darkness, a child rose who would learn only one truth, that mercy is weakness and fear is power. Years later, when Bokassa joined the French army, he found purpose in the precision of violence. He served in Indochina, in Algeria, learning not just warfare but dominance, the language of command. They said he fought like a man possessed, as if war itself whispered to him. He rose through the ranks quickly. But when the drums of independence began to thunder across Africa, Bokassa heard a different call, one that led him back to his homeland, the Central African Republic. There, in the fragile newborn state, his cousin David Dacko ruled, a polite, soft-spoken man trying to balance the weight of freedom and the shadow of France. Bokassa, freshly returned from military service, became his army chief. But behind his military salute was ambition, and a darkness that even Dacko could not see. For Bokassa, power was not something to be shared. It was to be devoured. On the night of December 31, 1965, as the world celebrated a new year, Bokassa made his move. While Dacko dined with his ministers, the capital was surrounded by soldiers loyal to Bokassa. They said the streets were silent, the kind of silence that only exists when fear itself is watching. By dawn, Bokassa declared himself president. His cousin, betrayed and powerless, was imprisoned. The republic had become his feast. At first the people cheered. He promised order, progress, and pride. Schools reopened, soldiers marched, and for a moment, just a moment, the country believed. But behind the uniforms and parades, something else began to grow. Bokassa no longer saw himself as a man. He saw himself as chosen. He surrounded himself with advisors who dared not breathe without his permission. His portraits began to multiply across the capital, in schools, offices, even churches. And then came the strange orders. Citizens were forced to memorize his speeches, to chant his name in public squares, to kneel when he appeared. And soon, whispers began to spread, that the president no longer walked among men but among spirits. He began to wear flowing robes of crimson and gold, his eyes always shielded by sunglasses even at night. He claimed to receive dreams from God, messages that justified his rage. And those who questioned him disappeared into the night, their families left only with silence and the faint smell of smoke near the barracks. But the hunger within him only grew. In 1972 he declared himself president for life. But even that was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted a throne. He began to study the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, another soldier who had crowned himself emperor. Bokassa read about the coronation, the gold, the glory. He decided that Africa too would have its emperor, and that he would be its god-king. Preparations began. French tailors were summoned, Parisian jewelers commissioned. He ordered a crown modeled after Napoleon's, made with over 7,000 diamonds. A golden eagle perched atop it, wings spread as if ready to take flight, or strike. The coronation took place on December 4, 1977. It was a spectacle of madness and magnificence. Over 2,000 guests, 50 white horses, and a golden carriage imported from France. Bokassa himself wore a velvet robe trimmed with ermine fur, weighing more than 80 pounds. He marched down a crimson carpet for an hour before seating himself upon a throne that cost as much as the nation's entire education budget. And in that moment, under the glare of the chandeliers, surrounded by music and incense, Jean-Bédel Bokassa placed the crown upon his own head and declared himself Bokassa I, Emperor of Central Africa. The crowd cheered. Cannons roared. But outside the palace walls, the people watched from shanties made of rust and dust, their stomachs empty, their children thin. The empire he created was not of gold, but of suffering. For in his empire, disobedience was death. He ruled with fear sharper than any blade. Ministers who disagreed with him vanished. Villages that resisted were burned. Children who laughed at his portrait were beaten. And then came the rumors, the whispers that chilled even his closest allies. Prisoners were taken to his private chambers and never returned. Bodies were buried in shallow graves near his residence. And inside his refrigerators, investigators would later claim, were things too horrifying to believe. The people said their emperor had become what he always wanted, something more than human. something monstrous. Some called him the cannibal emperor. Others said he was possessed by the spirits of the dead he had slain. The French, who once supported him, began to look away, ashamed of the monster they had helped create. But Bokassa? He did not hide. He laughed. He told journalists, "They fear me because I am strong. Because I am eternal." As the years passed, he lost all touch with reality. He would walk through the palace at midnight, wearing only his medals and a sword, demanding his servants bow before him. He spoke to portraits on the wall, calling them his ancestors. He kept lions as pets. And all the while the empire decayed. Schools collapsed. Hospitals went dark. But the palace still glimmered under imported chandeliers. He said it was a sign of divine order, that the emperor must shine, even if his people starve. And when the people finally broke, when the anger turned to rebellion, Bokassa met it the only way he knew, with blood. In 1979, hundreds of schoolchildren in the capital refused to buy government-issued uniforms, a protest against corruption. They were arrested, beaten, and taken to the emperor. What happened next would become one of the darkest days in African history. They say the palace gates opened at night, and the children were brought in. They say Bokassa himself joined in the beatings, that the screams could be heard across the river. And they say that when it was done, the emperor sat in silence, as if feeding on the fear that lingered in the air. A few months later, the French, once his allies, turned against him. While Bokassa was away in Libya, French paratroopers landed in Bangui. His empire fell without a fight. He fled, first to the Ivory Coast, then to France, living quietly in exile among the very people who once crowned him in diamonds. But monsters cannot rest. And empires built on blood never die cleanly. Years later, Bokassa returned home. No longer a god, no longer an emperor, just an old man in a worn coat, standing before the same people he once ruled. They arrested him immediately. He was tried for murder, for theft, for cannibalism. When the verdict came, Bokassa did not flinch. He said, "They cannot kill me. I'm already a legend." He was sentenced to death, later reduced to life in prison and then quietly pardoned. He lived the rest of his days in silence, pacing the halls of a small villa, muttering to himself that he had once been emperor of Africa. And when he died in 1996, there were no trumpets, no soldiers, no crowns. Just an old man and the echo of his own madness. Power is the sweetest poison. It begins as ambition, then becomes obsession, and finally hunger. And some men, like Bokassa, will feed on the world until there is nothing left to consume but themselves. When the storms came to Bangui, the emperor did not sleep. He would walk through the marble corridors barefoot, his golden robe dragging through puddles of rainwater seeping in from broken ceilings. Servants whispered that thunder did not frighten him. He spoke back to it, claiming it was God's applause. To his guards he was still a leader. To his ministers, a living nightmare. To himself, he was immortal. Jean-Bédel Bokassa, crowned in a ceremony that cost a fortune his nation never had, now ruled over silence. The glory was fading. The foreign guests were gone. The golden carriage stood abandoned, its wheels sinking into the mud. And yet, he remained convinced that the world trembled before him. Each morning he summoned his court not to govern but to perform. He sat upon his throne beneath a ceiling painted with angels and African warriors, his twisted version of heaven, and listened to praise. Ministers took turns reciting speeches written by fear. They called him the Son of Africa, the Lion of Bangui, the immortal emperor. He smiled at every word. But the smile never reached his eyes. Because the emperor could feel it, the world was beginning to turn against him. Outside his marble walls, the people starved. The French, who once treated him as a useful ally, were now disgusted by the spectacle of his madness. He had spent millions on diamonds, horses, and imported wines while hospitals had no medicine and schools no roofs. But Bokassa didn't see poverty. He saw disloyalty. And for him, disloyalty was sin. He began to surround himself with soldiers chosen not for their skill, but for their devotion. They called themselves the Imperial Guard, and their loyalty was absolute, bound by fear more than faith. At night, they patrolled the capital in armored trucks, their boots echoing on the empty streets. The citizens learned to stay indoors after sunset, because the streets belonged to the emperor's ghosts. Bokassa had grown paranoid. He claimed assassins were hiding in the shadows, that France was sending spies disguised as beggars. He banned certain colors from being worn near the palace. He executed officers for looking at him too long. And in the darkness of his chambers, he began to speak of demons. He said they visited him, whispering advice, demanding blood. His servants would hear him shouting into the void, cursing unseen enemies. Sometimes in the early hours of morning, guards found him sitting alone on the throne, his robe soaked in sweat, muttering prayers and curses in the same breath. But power, real power, demands constant sacrifice. And Bokassa began to provide it. Prisoners accused of treason were dragged into the palace courtyard. Some were shot, others beaten to death. He often watched from his balcony, smoking cigars imported from Havana, his expression cold and unblinking. He told his generals that watching death gave him strength, that he could feel their souls entering him. He said it was a gift from God. His generals said nothing. And then came the rumors. They started as whispers among the guards, stories that the emperor hosted midnight feasts where the air smelled of blood and roasted meat. That certain prisoners who vanished had not been buried but served. That Bokassa had developed a taste for human flesh, believing it would make him invincible. French journalists began investigating. Le Monde published an article describing Bokassa as a vampire emperor. Western intelligence reports spoke of refrigerators found later containing remains, though the truth was always blurred between horror and myth. But in the eyes of his people, truth no longer mattered. The emperor had become a monster. And yet, in his madness, he found moments of terrifying clarity. He once told a visiting French ambassador, "Do you know why your people love Napoleon? Because he was strong. Because he did not ask for love, he demanded fear. I am the same." Then he leaned closer and whispered, "But Napoleon never ate his enemies." No one dared to respond. The French grew nervous. Bokassa had become unpredictable, dangerous, especially since his closest ally Libya's Muammar Gaddafi had begun supplying him with weapons. Paris feared losing control of the region. And so, while they smiled for the cameras, the French government began quietly planning his downfall. But Bokassa could sense it. His paranoia turned to rage. He accused his ministers of conspiring with foreigners, executed officers, and ordered secret arrests. The prisons filled again. Then came the event that broke his empire. April 1979. The schoolchildren's protest. It began simply. Students refused to buy uniforms sold by a company owned by the emperor's wife. They marched, shouting for fairness. But to Bokassa, every voice that rose against him was treason. He ordered the army to stop the protests, and stop them they did. Witnesses described trucks filled with children, taken to a military camp outside Bangui. There the air turned red. Dozens were killed, their bodies dumped into shallow pits. Others said the emperor himself participated, striking the young with his cane, screaming that disobedience must die. For 3 days the city was silent. Even the birds seemed to avoid the palace. When word reached Paris, the French finally decided. They would end the reign of Bokassa. In September of that year, while the emperor was visiting Gaddafi in Libya, French paratroopers landed in Bangui under the operation named Barracuda. In a single night the empire fell. When Bokassa returned, his throne was gone, his palace looted, his portrait torn down from every wall. He fled across the desert like a ghost, a king without a kingdom, a god without believers. For years he wandered in exile, first in Ivory Coast, then in France. He lived quietly in a mansion in the suburbs of Paris, surrounded not by servants but by silence. Sometimes he would appear in expensive restaurants, wearing his medals, boasting to waiters that he had once ruled an empire. They thought he was mad. But madness, for Bokassa, was a crown he never took off. In interviews he denied everything. He called the stories of cannibalism Western lies. He said he was framed by France because he dared to challenge their control. And yet, his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of pride when journalists mentioned his fearsome reputation. He once said, "History will remember me not as a monster, but as a king who dared to dream too high. But dreams built on blood always drown in it." Years later, when he returned to the Central African Republic, he found his empire erased. The palace stood empty. The gardens were overgrown. Children played in the ruins of his throne room. The emperor's ghost had been replaced by laughter, the one sound he could never control. He was arrested on arrival, tried for murder, torture, and treason. The trial lasted months. Witnesses came forward with stories of horror, mass graves, disappearances, and feasts that could not be spoken of without trembling. Bokassa sat in court like a statue, his uniform pressed, his medals shining. He interrupted the judges often, declaring, "You cannot judge me. Only God can." When the death sentence came, he smiled. It was later reduced to life in prison. And in prison, Bokassa prayed. Every night. Loudly. He claimed to have visions, of angels who told him he was chosen again, that he would one day rise to rule Africa once more. His cellmate said he slept sitting upright, as if afraid that lying down would make him mortal. Years later he was quietly pardoned. He spent his last days in a villa outside Bangui, cared for by his wives and children. He told them stories of his empire, always glorious, never bloody. He said he had dined with presidents, not prisoners. He said God had forgiven him. But forgiveness is not remembrance. When he died in 1996, the world barely noticed. No parades. No crowns. No fire. Only the hum of the jungle reclaiming what had always belonged to it. His grave remains unmarked, his legacy buried beneath dust and silence. And yet, when the wind moves through the ruins of his palace, some say you can still hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the halls where an emperor once ruled by terror and called it destiny. Because some thrones are not built for men. They are built for monsters. And Bokassa I, Africa's blood emperor, proved that even monsters can wear crowns. The world had forgotten Jean-Bédel Bokassa. But Bokassa never forgot the world. In his final years, hidden behind the high walls of his Bangui villa, he still wore his medals. Every morning, he stood before a cracked mirror and whispered to his reflection, "Your Majesty." His children avoided those moments. They said he spoke to his reflection as if it were an audience. Sometimes he saluted it. Sometimes he wept before it. The emperor had no throne, but in his mind the empire still existed. He kept a faded photograph of Napoleon on his desk, the same one he had ordered copied onto his coronation banners decades earlier. Beneath it he had written, "Power is eternal. Men only borrow it. But power, when built on blood, demands payment, and even ghosts can come to collect." There were nights when Bokassa's servants heard him screaming in his sleep. They said he dreamt of the children, the ones who never returned home. He shouted their names, then begged for forgiveness, then cursed the French. Some nights, he would wake drenched in sweat, muttering that the spirits are angry. He claimed the jungle whispered to him, that the trees around his villa groaned with the voices of those buried beneath them. He began building small shrines around the property, wooden crosses, carved symbols, and bowls filled with offerings. He said it kept the dead quiet. But silence never lasted long. The whispers about Bokassa's cruelty refused to die. In the villages, mothers told their children stories, that the emperor had eaten men to steal their courage, that his spirit still roamed the forest looking for new souls to feed on. They called him the vampire of Bangui. And legends, once they begin to breathe, never stop. Years after his death, French journalists returned to the ruins of his palace. They found grand halls filled with bats, thrones covered in dust, and fragments of gold leaf falling from the ceilings. In one room they found what was left of his coronation stage, the same place where he had declared himself emperor of all Central Africa. It was quiet now. Only the echoes of drums remained. They spoke to old generals, cooks, servants, people who had seen too much and lived long enough to remember. Some said the emperor had truly lost his mind. Others swore he had made a pact with dark forces, that his strength, his charisma, even his survival were unnatural. And perhaps, in a way, they were right. Because Bokassa's empire was not built on politics or power alone. It was built on fear. And fear is immortal. Even France, the nation that created him, armed him, and later destroyed him, could not escape the shadow he left behind. Decades later, documents surfaced showing how deeply France had supported his rule. They had funded his coronation, supplied him with arms, smiled for photographs as he called himself emperor. Then, when the world began to watch, they turned away, pretending they never knew him. Bokassa, even in exile, knew this. He said once, "The French made me. Then they betrayed me. But they will never erase me." And in a way he was right again. To understand Bokassa is to understand the madness of power. He was not born a monster. He was born a soldier, brave, cunning, and ambitious. He fought for France in World War II. He received medals for courage. But courage without conscience is just another word for cruelty. When he returned to his homeland, he found a country desperate for order. And he gave it, through fear. At first, he built roads, schools, and hospitals. He wanted greatness. But somewhere along the line he stopped ruling for his people, and began ruling over them. He began to believe he was chosen, not by politics, not by fate, but by God himself. That belief, unchecked, became something darker. He surrounded himself with sycophants who called him divine, guards who killed in his name, priests who blessed his madness. The world outside called him brutal, but in his palace he heard only the echoes of worship. Every tyrant starts with a dream. And every dream, when poisoned by ego, becomes a nightmare. Bokassa's nightmare consumed a nation. And when it ended, it left behind something that could not be buried, a warning written in fear. It's easy to call him a monster. It's harder to admit he was human. Because monsters, unlike men, have no choice. But Bokassa chose, again and again, to be cruel. He could have been remembered as a hero, a founder, a liberator. Instead he chose to be feared. And when he lost that fear, when his soldiers turned, when his palace fell, the silence that followed was the only thing he truly deserved. In the end, Bokassa died surrounded not by glory but by ghosts. His empire was gone. His name became a curse. And yet, his story remains, a reminder that history's darkest chapters are not written by demons, but by men who believe they are gods. Across Africa there are many names whispered in fear: Shaka, Munsaidi, Bokassa. But among them one stands apart. Because his hunger wasn't just for land or gold or power. His hunger was deeper. It was the hunger of a man who wanted to devour the world, to consume it, body and soul, and wear its terror as his crown. They say that at night, when lightning flashes over Bangui, you can see his palace for a second, glowing white in the distance like a ghost rising from the earth. And if you listen closely, over the wind and the rain, you might hear a faint whisper: "Long live the emperor." Then silence. Because even monsters must rest.